about. So, as I say, we have two speakers tonight. Our first speaker will be Alan Thornett, who, as many of you will know, is a long-time contributor to socialist resistance. Perhaps not somebody who you would have expected, had you met him even 20 years ago, to be such a committed eco-socialist as he's been since then. And if you want to find out more of the story of how he got to where he is today, I'd really recommend his excellent book, Facing the Apocalypse: Arguments for Eco-Socialism, which talks about his journey from being a worker in the Cowley car plant to being a very deeply committed eco-socialist. Our second speaker, who we're very pleased to have tonight, is somebody who's worked with Alan for a significant part of that journey. Pritam Singh is and now I've forgotten the exact title, but he's associated with Wolfson College in Oxford. These days, he's been a committed eco-socialist and activist for many years, and he's a member of the Green Party.
Hi everyone. And thanks to Terry for the kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk to eco-socialist friends and socialist resistance associated group of people and others who might have seen the notice of the meeting and are joining the discussion. What I intend to do is talk about a number of contesting responses to the economic and the health crisis created by COVID-19. And on that basis, look at those responses and critically evaluate them from an eco-socialist viewpoint. To start with, I would say that the economic crisis created by COVID-19 is the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. In terms of its impact on the capitalist economy, its capacity to expand, its capacity to create jobs, the reduction of economic activity, and the health crisis created by COVID-19 is the biggest health crisis since the flu 1918. So it's a major crisis. It's not one of those cyclical crises which one saw in the 1980s and to a larger extent in 2007, 2019 crisis, and it is of that dimension. Now, I would say that there are three main responses. I will talk about a fourth one, but I first want to focus on three main responses to this economic crisis. The first one is Keynesian, which I will elaborate shortly. The second is what I would call old socialists. And the third is the eco-socialist. And I would at the end, after having discussed the differences between three of them, would also see that there are possibilities of commonalities between the threes, which also suggests a certain common platform of action. So looking at the first one, the Keynesian response. Keynesian response is a bit similar to how Keynesians responded to 1929-33 Great Depression crisis. That the main contribution of Keynes was that crisis has been created by deficit demand, that there was not enough demand in the economy, working class didn't have enough purchasing power, and that led to decrease in demand. And if there is not enough demand, the output cannot expand, and if output doesn't expand, that leads to unemployment, and therefore there is this kind of vicious cycle which got created in the economy. So Keynes' main contribution was to say that in a situation of crisis like that, in a situation of Great Depression, the market economy itself cannot solve this problem. Because before Keynes, the dominant paradigm of neoclassical economics argued that market has this inherent capacity to resolve the disequilibrium. that if there is an excess supply, that will lead to decline in prices. Decline in the prices will lead to rise in demand, and a new equilibrium will be established. Similarly, if there is an excessive demand, that will lead to rise in prices, and therefore, there will be excess supply because suppliers will be motivated by rise in prices. So supply will catch up with demand, and there will be equilibrium in the market. So the point was that even if there is a disequilibrium, normally you would expect our market to have the equilibrium, but even if there is a disequilibrium, the forces of supply and demand in the market will be able to correct that disequilibrium and bring the economy back to equilibrium. So which was like saying that capitalist economy is capable of resolving its own crisis through the market mechanism. The contribution of Keynes was to say that it cannot do it because the level of deficiency in factor demand is so high that private sector will not be able to bring out this equilibrium. So there's a need for state intervention. And he mentioned state intervention in two domains, one on the supply side, on the other on the demand side. On the supply side, he argued that state has to start public investment, that state has to take upon public investment even in those areas where there is no expectation of profitability. And once state takes up those activities, then those activities will have a multiplier effect. You start building a school, and building a school will require other instruments, other outputs, and their demand will expand. And similarly, if you start building a road or a bridge, there will be other cement and steel and so on and so forth. Their demand will pick up, and therefore the interlinkages, the total demand will pick up, total supply will pick up. So that is on the kind of supply side, that public sector investment has to come. It is not the market. The second was on the demand side. He argued that he used one concept called marginal propensity to consume, which means that the capacity to consume, marginal capacity to consume of the lower income groups is higher, which means that if you give them an extra income, they are likely to spend a greater amount of that income on consumption compared with the rich, whose consumption needs have been fulfilled and they will mainly save. And in an economy where you need to increase consumption, you need to transfer income from the rich to the poor, so that the poor will have more income and they will spend it, and aggregate demand will get speeded up. So he argued, and proved successful. And then Keynes was the godfather of bourgeois economics, and many right-wing economists even condemned him, saying that he's anti-capitalist. But he said, no, I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm just trying to save capitalism from a bigger disaster. I'm trying to, So that's, some of the Keynesians are saying this, that what we need to do now is to go back to the state intervention. There is a more need for state intervention and in various forms. That is one. But what is lacking in the Keynesian perspective is that they do not have the dimension of ecology. That during Keynes' time, one, there was no proper understanding of the role of ecology in the economy. Secondly, there wasn't any ecological crisis that time. Global warming wasn't very high. Biodiversity loss wasn't that very high, which is a huge problem right now. In one sense, ecological crisis probably is bigger than the crisis being created by COVID-19. So they don't have the ecological dimension. So that's one kind of flaw in the Keynesian, my criticism of the Keynesian schema. Then the old socialists who believe in distribution of income, the more radical ones would say that capitalism needs to be overthrown, and then we need to have a socialist organization of the society and the economy. Other social democratic ones would say that we need more distribution of income. We need more just society and fair society. Wages should be high, minimum wage should be protected, and so on and so forth. And which is also a bit similar to Keynesianism in the sense that they also ask for state intervention. They ask for planning, reduction of the market economy. But the old socialists of the Soviet variety also do not have the ecological dimension in their perspective. And they focus more on social justice, but they do not bring into question the ecological justice of relationship between human beings and non-human beings, and the question of ecological sustainability. So that will be my criticism, despite appreciating their concern about social justice. The eco-socialist outlook is the only one which on one hand recognizes that this is a very, very deep crisis of capitalism brought out by COVID-19. And this crisis has two dimensions. One dimension is the economic crisis, which is about unemployment and people's standards of living falling down. And the other is the ecological crisis. And that they both need to be brought together. And their way of bringing together is one to say, in the long run or in the medium run, we need to replace capitalism with socialism. But to say that may not be sufficient because the question arises what to do in the present. So there we have a transitional program that we have to have a transitional path towards that eco-socialism from where we are standing. And the Green New Deal or the Socialist Green New Deal is the path to that. And what is Socialist Green Deal? Many of you would have read about it, and there are various versions of that. Basically, it argues that yes, economic activities need to be picked up, state needs to be intervening, but state needs to be intervening in those spheres of the economy where there can be green jobs, that you need to have efficient buildings, so there need to be energy efficiency, there need to be restructuring of transport, and there need to be retraining of people as green electricians, green plumbers, green architects, green, energy specialists. And so there are a whole lot of new jobs which need to be created, which are based on green retrofit of the economy. And that's how economy will come out of this. But other difference of the eco-socialists from the Keynesians and the old style socialists would be that the Greens are not saying that we should emphasize growth for growth's sake. Okay, that the Keynesians are saying that we need to have growth. Socialists also tend to argue that we need to have growth, and therefore both will argue for industrialization, increase in productivity, improvement in technology, and so on and so forth. Eco-socialists saying that we need to have sustainability, that a kind of growth through green economic activities, which lead to the greening of the economy, protection of the environment, protection of other species, does not lead to biodiversity, even if the aggregate level of economic growth is lower, because we don't measure the aggregate economic growth only by GDP. We look at other indicators, the quality of air, the quality of water, and general standards of living, the amount of leisure time which people have, and so on and so forth, and the relationship to other living creatures. So, in other words, eco-socialists are able to see some merit in the Keynesian view, that Keynesians are able to point out that flaws in the market economy. They're also able to see some merit in the socialists. They want to argue for justice, but they take it further forward, that we need a twin justice. We need social justice and ecological justice. Now, having said the differences, there is one big commonality between them. And that commonality is that the time has come where even within the confines of a capitalist economy, we need to bring reforms which are based on taxation of the rich. That how does the state raises resources, especially when huge amount of expenditure has been incurred by the state, how does the state cover that expenditure? That expenditure has to come through taxing the rich. Now there is a talk about windfall tax, and that's one of the taxes, but basically taxing on high income groups, which means reversing of the many years of past economic policies in most advanced countries, where taxation has moved in the direction of lowering the taxation on high income groups, on corporate taxes, and putting the burden on the middle classes and the working classes. And last time when the economic crisis came up in 2007, 2019, the burden of that crisis fell on poor and the middle classes, and the rich escaped. And that is one reason inequalities have expanded. That the argument was that the state has spent too much, and that is why the state is indebted. And in order to cover that debt, state needs to decrease its expenditure, And when that expenditure has to be increased, the cut was only basically on services which were helping the poor people, whether it's the unemployment allowance or cut in child benefit or old people's allowances or disability allowance and so on and so forth. So we found that the response to the last crisis, the ruling classes were very easily able to convert the whole argument by saying we need austerity. Austerity means that state should withdraw, which was basically mean leaving it to the market mechanism. And the justification was that in order to decrease the burden on the state for expenditure, you have to leave various activities to the market mechanism. And but this time the crisis is so deep, and both the economic crisis, but equally the ecological crisis, that I got 2 minutes. So there is that platform that we can have a convergence or a coalition of people who come from a Keynesian background, especially the left Keynesians. There are some people who also call themselves green Keynesians, who would be very close to us, who would say that we do want economy to expand, but in the green dimension. And among the old socialists who may not be very much into the ecological discourse, but there is this, that society needs redistribution of income, and redistribution of income means taxing the rich, restoring the various benefits and of low income groups. But just 1 minute, last minute, I will use by saying that there is a fourth possibility, which is just opposite of all of them. That in the way the ruling classes responded to the 2007-8 crisis, that they will be able to turn that into saying that people need to tighten belts. And tighten belts means, again, poor and middle classes. They might try that. In order to try that, they will probably try to divert people's attention by whipping up nationalism, whether it is in USA or in Brazil or in Turkey or in India, so that people's attention is focused into wars and conflicts on ethnic and national basis. And so that we have to ward off. And it's a unity, it's a commonality, it's a coalition between the three perspectives that I think has the great amount of strength to fight against that right-wing reaction. I think I'll at the moment I'll stop here.
You won't hear me because I hadn't unmuted myself. Thank you so much, Pritam, particularly for stepping in to go first at the last minute. That's great. Alan, I need you to unmute yourself. I don't seem to be able to do that.
Alan himself can do it, or he is not able to hear.
Yeah, no, he can hear now.
Okay. I think he should himself be able to do it.
Yes, yeah, that's great. No, you've muted yourself now. We can't hear you.
Yeah, now it's fine. It's fine, Alan.
No, it's fine, but there's a big block in the middle of the screen, so I don't know if it's going to stay that way. So anyway, apologies for having technical problems at the start, and again, thanks for Pritam for stepping in and coming first. I'm really pleased to be speaking with Pritam because we've been collaborating on the defence of eco-socialism and promoting eco-socialism for a very long time. Probably 10 years, something like that. But that's all very good. I'm taking a fairly dramatically different angle of this. I mean, there are so many huge angles to this, obviously, this crisis as a whole. And I'm going to focus on the virus itself and the implications of the virus. And I'm going to try to establish that today's model of human society, with its highly destructive relationship with nature, and its highly globalized structure is incompatible with the continuation of human life on the planet, probably beyond this century. That's what I'm going. That's the theme I'm going to speak to, and I want to start with two crucial points. I think from an eco-socialist standpoint. The first is that it's necessary, in my view, to recognise that the COVID-19 crisis is a part of the total eco-socialist crisis itself. It's not running alongside it. It's not coming at the same time. It's directly a part of the ecological crisis. Ecology being the relationship between different organisms and between those organisms and the planet. The second point is that I think, as I've indicated, I think COVID-19 represents a direct threat to the future of life on the planet, and is on a par with other such major threats, such as global warming, pollution and acidification of the oceans, mass extinction of species, the water crisis, and everything else. In fact, I think it's probably possible to argue that this is maybe the most potent crisis of all, and that if we had to look forward to what's going to hit us hardest by mid-century or the rest of this century, it may well be viruses of this kind, and in fact more dangerous viruses even than this one. When I thought about the title of this and came up with COVID-19 Changes Everything, I also had in mind COVID-19, a direct threat to life on the planet, and I also thought about COVID-19, the mother of all wake-up calls. And I noticed that Inga Anderson, the executive director of the UN Environmental Programme, said recently of this pandemic that this pandemic is an SOS signal for the human enterprise. So I think that's the level that we need to discuss it. Coronavirus is, of course, as is now well known and has been much debated, are crossover species from other species, animal species, that exist in reservoirs in host species when those species have strong enough immune systems to stand them and to host them over a long period of time. And that most opinion is that COVID-19 was a spillover from wet market in Wuhan and from fruit bats and maybe other animals, and it comes. This is not a proven point. I mean, I accept that, but what I think is overwhelmingly the case is that these kind of spillovers come under very stressed conditions when humans and animals, other species, interact under very stressful circumstances. Then such crossovers can take place, and they are very dangerous. We have no immunity to them initially, and that they are completely new situation. The point I want to add to that is that although these kind of viruses have been around for a very long time, spillover viruses, I think we're in a greater danger from such spillover viruses today than in any time in history. And as I don't know if Terry mentioned it in the intro, but you know, I put an article on the SR website yesterday, which is a longer version basically of this this introduction, arguing this point at some length. And the changes that have taken place to make such spillover viruses more frequent and probably more deadly. I mean, this one is supposed to be a 100-year event. I don't think anybody would think it's any longer a 100-year event. We should probably talk about more like a 10-year event. But there are major problems. I mean, it's human impact. It's created by human impact. And the particular human impact that we need to look towards is industrialized agriculture. This is common ground, everybody thinks that. Habitat destruction, deforestation, and so on, which I think is common ground. But there is another, seems to be more controversial reason for this, which seems that some on the left don't really want to discuss it, which is human population density. And wherever you study this, wherever it's written about, human population density is one of the factors. It's not the only factor, but it is one of the factors involved. And social distancing obviously is an attempt to combat human population density. Behind the strategies of, I think, all the governments, possibly excepting the Chinese, I don't know, is that the way to destroy this virus eventually is through a vaccine. And they're all keeping their fingers crossed, and they're pouring money into attempts to find a vaccine. And they're working on the basis that a vaccine will be found in about a year, maybe a bit more. I think there's a huge issue in this, and it's something that the World Health Organization says from time to time, and that is that there may not be a vaccine. There may not be a vaccine. I don't know what odds they give it, maybe 50-50, I don't know, but maybe there won't be a vaccine. Now, if there's not a vaccine, that's really a huge problem. It creates a huge problem, because without a vaccine, the only way it can be, this vaccine will become endemic, and it have to be fought on and on and on, and it will flare up from time to time, and will be an ongoing struggle against it. But even if a vaccine is found, and it might be, such viruses are prone to mutate. This one apparently already has to some extent, and the vaccine becomes useless. Alongside that, there is the danger of other such viruses emerging as well, crossover viruses, much more dangerous ones, such as, for example, Ebola, which has a fatality rate of 65%, or the Nipah virus, which has also has a similar fatality rate. And what we have to remember is that no vaccine has yet been found for a coronavirus. Common cold is a coronavirus, and they've been looking for a very long time and haven't found a vaccine. This is a very, very big threat, and it's being pushed to one side because it's sort of the nightmare scenario. But even then, other vaccines, with these vaccines becoming more frequent and therefore more dangerous because more of them are brought into a human domain, then this is an ongoing problem, because they've got to try and find a vaccine for everyone that comes forward. And this is a big danger, I think, that is being avoided in many ways. So I think we shouldn't avoid it. We should say that we're in a new stage of the relationship of human beings with the rest of the natural world. We've now got this very dangerous process which can happen at any time, and that so this is not not just an economic issue, or the fact that there's going to be the biggest economic process for 300 years and everything else. This is a matter of our relationship with nature, and unless we change it, we will be under continuous threat. And this is where I have a list of demands at the end of my text. There could be many more, but they're aimed at altering the relationship between human beings and nature. It has to start with zero carbon by 2030. Otherwise the climate will run out of control. There has to be a comprehensive changeover to renewable energy. There has to be a pulling back on the issue of globalization. Really, we should be saying localization rather than globalization, and no return to mass air travel, or no return to airport expansion. It should now be reduction of airport capacity, and not the expansion of it. And as Pritam has said, an end to habitat destruction and the ongoing extinction of species, which is now running 1,000 times faster than the background rate. An end to industrial agriculture, and in particular, an end to the meat side of industrial agriculture, because in the same way that we can't, the planet won't tolerate the level of air travel, which has now become the norm in recent years, nor can it tolerate the amount of meat which is being eaten by the human population, and meat which is being produced in the most destructive way by feeding to cattle huge amounts of corn, which with the use of fertilizers that then runs off the fields into the rivers and into the seas and causes dead zones, and the acidification of the ocean and so on, and also uses vast amounts of water which we don't have. So all these things have to be aimed at drastically reducing the impact of human beings on nature. Because if we can't reduce that impact, some say, nature is striking back. I mean, it doesn't sit down and around the table and decide to do that, but the way that it's hitting back is that we can only put a certain amount of pressure on nature before very nasty things can happen, which threaten our own existence. So we have to have a completely different relationship. In fact, nature, or let's say even the pandemic, has started to point the way really in which we have to go, because emissions have now gone down for the first time in a very long time. The air is getting cleaner, the water's getting cleaner, and the reason it's doing is that the things that are normally destroying it, or even parked up at airports, are on the side of the road and then no longer running in the same numbers. So things can change once we change our activities to enough in order to bring that about. But it is a big ask to make these kind of changes. There is no doubt. But if we face a situation where we have no future unless it is done, then a lot of things can be done that haven't yet been done in the past. We also have to, of course, at the same time, we have to demand, you know, in terms of the economic situation, we have to demand massive investment, the abolition of the debt, and we have to demand that that where investment goes is, as Pritam was saying, that it's green investment. No back to the old situation. We have to have a completely different. We have to build a completely different kind of normal once this situation comes to an end. The old normal is no longer acceptable, and in fact, I mean, I would say that if we end up coming out of this whole pandemic and we go back to the old ways of relying on carbon energy and everything else, and filling the oceans with plastic and everything else, it would be a complete disaster. It would be a huge opportunity missed to take this as a wake-up call and start changing our ways as a result of it, and making the planet a safer place at the same time.
Thank you so much, Alan. That's great. So we do have some questions already. Maybe there will be more as the discussion progresses. So I've got one question addressed particularly to Alan, one question addressed particularly to Pritam, although I'm struggling to find the question in it, but it's an interesting point which relates to what Pritam said, and one question addressed to both of you that I'm going to take in this round. So, Alan, the question to you, which perhaps you saw because you touched on it towards the end of your introduction, was about debt forgiveness. And it says, can you comment on the need for debt forgiveness being an essential component before any of the other factors you list in your article? And to Pritam, there was a question pointing out that the Great Dust Bowl development in the US between 35 and 38 was an ecological crisis caused by the nature of agricultural production in the US, even going back then. Many of us think about industrial agriculture as something that started after the Green Revolution, but in fact it goes back much earlier, particularly in the US. And the failure to address that was a problem that the left didn't address, and had a massive impact on people working in agriculture in that period of the States. Be interested to have your reflections on that. And then a question to both of you, which I'm just struggling to find because these questions are long. Which is about what you think the role of animals and the human-animal relationship is within eco-socialism. So if we could take those, so I'll take Pritam first because Alan perhaps needs a rest.
Okay, right. Well, I think that's a good observation, that shortly after the Great Depression, there was this ecological crisis in agriculture, in American agriculture. And I think that needs to be taken into account. But what I was trying to emphasize was the current scenario in which different people are responding to this crisis, and trying to think about how to deal with this in a positive way. I mean, of course, there's a right-wing way, which I mentioned at the end, that kind of trying to whip up nationalism and ethnic conflicts as a way of diverting attention. But Keynesian, socialist, eco-socialist responses are positive, different ways of positive kind of reaction to the crisis. But I think that in any further development of my thought and if I write something, I've already written something on this, which I can share with you. I would consider this also, that the 30s was not only an economic crisis, it was also accompanied by an ecological crisis. So there is a kind of continuity going on. But I should also mention that the scale of ecological crisis which we face now wasn't known at that time. One, of course, is global warming, which Alan also mentioned, that it is now almost consensus among all serious climate scientists that if by 2030 the global temperature is not kept below 1.5 degree centigrade, higher than what it was in the pre-industrial age, which is roughly before the Industrial Revolution, we are heading for an irreversible ecological crisis. Now, one, that problem wasn't there. The level of global warming wasn't high. Secondly, the biodiversity loss was there, but it wasn't known. Similarly, there was an ecological crisis, but it was not known. The situation now is that we have an unprecedented ecological crisis in the form of global warming and biodiversity loss, but also the knowledge about this. So therefore, there is an inadequacy of the Keynesian framework. So that's what I would say, that the difference there was ecological implications of the economic crisis and Great Depression, but the scale and the intensity wasn't as much as what we are facing now.
Do you want to respond about the question about the relationship between humans and animals?
I think Alan is more competent to deal with this, but I would say this, that in most discourses on ecological crisis, there is so much emphasis on global warming that the other dimension of the ecological crisis, biodiversity loss, is normally missed out. And I think Alan has done a wonderful job in his presentation to highlight that the biodiversity loss is equally important. And biodiversity loss also means that we have to change our ways of living, including our personal styles of life. And the point about that is that this planet is not meant only for human beings. This planet is meant for all living creatures. And there is an ecological balance between human and non-human beings. The past history has been a history of human beings dominating other beings. And to some extent, there is also that phase of element in Marxist thinking that, for example, at one stage, Frederick Engels says that socialism is, freedom from necessity and freedom from dependence upon nature. It is a struggle to conquer nature. So it is not a question of conquering nature. It's a question of living with nature. That is the kind of, and discourse we need to change. And that we can only understand if we also keep in mind the biodiversity loss as an equal dimension along with global warming. And they're both close to each other. In fact, global warming leads to biodiversity loss because global warming does lead to death of animals and other kind of species which are more vulnerable to global warming. So the relationship with animals and the ecological balance is absolutely equal part of the ecological discourse which the eco-socialists argue.
Thanks, Pritam. Alan, would you like to take those two questions, the one on debt forgiveness and the one on the relationship with animals?
Yes, indeed. Well, debt forgiveness is a fundamental issue. I mean, I've realised it wasn't in my text. I'll make sure it is, but not before these other issues. Not before at all. It has to be at the same time and part of the same struggle. We can't sit back and wait until debts have been cancelled before we start doing all these other things. And we have to do them whether debts are cancelled or not. So So that would be my attitude to that. We have to do these things straight away. And I would also say, which is in my article, but and this will be controversial, which is in my article, but I didn't include in my speech. When we put these demands of changing our relationships with the natural world and with the planet and everything else, of course, the first demands we put is on corporate power and on governments and on institutions to change the framework of society. But I think there is also a personal responsibility involved to lower our own carbon and ecological footprints. I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense to say we demand governments do it and then we carry on chomping away on hamburgers or something. You know, our lives have to reflect the struggles that the demands we're putting and the struggles that we're carrying out, because we can carry them out much better if our own actions reflect that. I mean, I'm not arguing that everybody should be a vegan or even a vegetarian, or that nobody should fly. But what I am saying is think carefully about it, weigh up its implications on the planet, and then you know, start from that point. Not just do it. Nothing to do with me, Gov. You know, I can carry on flying as much as I like, but I'll demand no airport expansion and all that kind of thing. There is also a personal responsibility. So there's that. Then there's animals. Well, I mean, you know, I've just made a contribution trying to make the point that unless we change our relationship to other species, the consequence of that relationship will kill us through viruses. So that's one thing. That's one thing about our relationship with animals. And also, bearing in mind what I just said, I think we should eat a lot less of them. And we should also treat the ones that we do rear as domestic animals. We should treat with respect and stamp out any cruelty to them. But there are some extremely perverse activities that human beings get involved in with animals. And when we're talking about the coronavirus, I mean, that is one of them. I mean, bushmeat. Bushmeat is a massive global industry that is not only destroying biodiversity, but it's creating conditions for crossovers of viruses, and it's incredibly cruel. You know, not all wet markets are the same. I mean, I would definitely say that not all wet markets are the same, but there are wet markets that deal in multiple species in extremely cruel conditions, where they're all stacked in crates, one across the other, all pissing and shitting on each other and everything else. You know, and then are killed under very cruel conditions, and some of these, you know, seriously endangered species. The pangolin, I would say. The pangolin. Look at what's happening to that. That's probably going to go extinct before most people have ever seen one, and mostly because not only because people like to eat it, but because it has scales which are reputed to have medicinal value when it has no medicinal value whatsoever. Sharks' fins. 100 million sharks a year are killed for their fins. Generally chucked back with no fins, just to sink to the bottom. 100 million a year. I mean, the carnage that human beings are inflicted on animals is, you know, almost beyond belief. So there's a long way to go. Big game hunting, just going out and shooting animals for fun. It's not just in Africa; it's all over Europe. Shooting wild animals it's completely perverse, and we should just stop doing it.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, just before I take another round of questions, I just wanted to tell people about 2 further events that Socialist Resistance is involved in putting on. The first of them is to say that on this Saturday, but I can't yet give you the time because it's not yet confirmed, we will be co-hosting together, certainly with comrades in Belgium and probably with comrades elsewhere, a meeting which will be addressed by activists from the United States talking about the fantastic development of the Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen over the last fortnight. So please, if you haven't already signed up to our newsletter to stay in touch, make sure you do that. Make sure you look at our website regularly and make sure you look at our Facebook page, because the details for that, which will be live streamed to our Facebook page, and I think without the hiccups we had at the beginning of this meeting, it'll be live streamed there at some point on Saturday, so you'll be able to find out about that, and it will also be available afterwards if people aren't available at that time. And then 2 weeks from tonight, in the next of this series of meetings, we will be hosting a very important book launch for a book called More Than My Left Foot, written by an extremely impressive and important comrade, Bob Williams Finlay. It's part autobiography, but it's also an analysis of all sorts of things, but including the student movement in Britain in the 1970s and 80s. But most notably, it's a long look at the model of the social model of disability and why it is so critical for the left as a whole to take those discussions on board. And I hope that at least as many comrades as are here tonight will join us for that meeting, where Bob himself will be joined by Sandra Daniels, who's also a disabled activist in the West Midlands, and also by Paul Mackney, who also knows Bob from his Birmingham days, but is the former president of NATFE, the Further Education Union. So I'm certainly looking forward to that and making sure it's in my diary. So now to get back to the questions, and I might have missed some while I've been talking to you. So one standalone question, which is primarily aimed at Pritam, but Alan might have things to say about it. In fact, I'm sure he will. Martin, the questioner, says that Pritam gave a great summary of the economic threads that need to be united. But what about political strategy, and what can we do to push forward the concept of the Green New Deal up the political agenda? And then a pair of questions from different people, but in the same area, one of which from Alma says, what can we do to bring forward the tax and dividend proposal? And the second one of which says, well, would it work, or is regulation not a better road? So I think those two things make sense together. So again, I'll come back to Pritam first.
Yeah, right. I think that is really a very important question from a political point of view, that what politics to adopt, and because unless there's a political activity, those programs cannot be implemented. Well, in the context of Western bourgeois democracies, the question is of coming to power. Now, eco-socialists cannot come to power on their own. There are social democratic parties, smaller green parties, and maybe smaller groups. I think that our attempt is to build a coalition. And to that extent, we also have to fight out the sectarianism within the Labour Party, which does not want to associate with anyone. I mean, I'm in the Green Party and was sympathetic to the Labour Party under Corbyn, and Caroline Lucas was very sympathetic to him as well. And but the kind of association and cooperation which the Greens were suggesting to Labour, Labour wasn't responding even under Corbyn. So there is a kind of parochialism, and somewhere or the other we need to reach to those Labour activists at the ground level, to the leadership, that at this moment a coalition is needed. And I would think that the coalition is also need to be broader than that. That even among the Lib Dems, there are people who are quite aware on the environmental issues. Lib Dems are a bit weak on many other issues, but on the environmental question, they generally seem to be sympathetic. They're not very well informed. And also on the regional parties, Socialist, Scottish National Party and the Welsh National Party, that the question in this country, I mean, another country we'll have to think of in another way. In this country, I think there's a need for building an alliance, building a coalition, which can then, I mean, elections are a bit far away at the moment, but you never know what can happen. And we need to be preparing for capture of power and a replacement of this Tory government, because this is the most right-wing government, and very soon it will become very, very clear. There might be divisions within the Conservative Party, but we can't expect them to deal with the question of the ecological crisis and the economic crisis. So we do need a change of government, and before the national government to change, at the local level, at the devolution level, there needs to be greater emphasis on this, and also more unity between different left-wing organizations. So the main thing I would kind of conclude from this is that overcoming sectarianism, overcoming that our line is the best and others are, we need to develop that thinking. A coalition of alliances is kind of my response to that. And out of this also comes the answer to the second question of putting kind of stop to dividends or imposing windfall taxes, that it's only a coalition of this which can have this program within it, that we need a major restructuring of a distribution of income, that inequality have grown, and these inequalities are economically disasters, ecologically disasters. And I think there is a fair amount of consensus on that among all the parties which are mentioned. Maybe not so much the Lib Dems, but all others. They do seem to be favorable to question of equality. So again, I think alliance is needed on that basis as well. That's what I think.
Thank you, Pritam. Alan?
Yes. Yes, I think Green New Deal, I think we need a new Green New Deal, in the sense that, as the title of this meeting says, COVID-19 changes everything.
Yeah.
It's also changed the conditions under which we need a Green New Deal, because a Green New Deal now, I think, needs to come in the framework of coming out of this pandemic, with big green changes having taken place, not in going back to the old carbon-based norm. So from that point of view, I think we need to, in our different coalitions, and I work in Red Green Labour, that there's that we need to look at the Green New Deal again and tailor it to how this pandemic should end, and what we need to get out of it, and what investment should be made, and everything else in order to, when we emerge from this pandemic. Because as I said before, if we end up back in the old carbon nightmare after all this, it will be a tragedy. Now, on fee and dividend, they're two good questions. I mean, I'm an advocate of fee and dividend. I wrote about it extensively in my book, which is the general principle put forward by James Hansen a long time ago, is that you have to tax the polluters. You have to heavily, and fee and dividend is a scheme by which you would heavily tax or place a fee on carbon at the point of production and give the money in a heavily progressive basis to the population directly into their pockets, so that they would have more money. Think that carbon-based things become more expensive, and they spend their money on green things, and so on. The question, would it be better to go down the regulation road? It's a really big question, a really big question, because what it sort of says is, what I take that as means, why shouldn't the government just cut back production of fossil fuel? Why doesn't it just cut back the production of petrol, for example? Or why doesn't it just cut it back? And it's a big one, because if we're going to make major changes, like changing the way that people lead their lives and what they buy and what they consume and what they eat and everything else, it's not only got to be done with consent, but it's got to be done with massive support. And the thing about fee and dividend is it has the potential to generate mass support, because you're putting money directly in people's pockets at the expense of the rich, and it could generate massive support. And then, so if you're going to reduce the production of carbon dioxide, you have to do it from the demand side. You've got to reduce the demand for it, because if you just cut the production, it'll be like the yellow vests in France. You know, you've got to anything you do in terms of cutting back CO2 emissions has to be done within the framework of a big transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor. The problem in France with the yellow vests was that the green taxes that were put on there were part of a regressive overall framework. So I think that what you have to take people forward, you have to win them to the project, and then you have to and then you can, and if you make the fee progressive, which is what Hansen proposes, it keeps going up, it drives CO2 emissions out of the system, and at the same time is popular at the same time. So I mean, I'm very keen on that. I mean, again, these are all very big issues. They can't be, they're not easy to introduce, but they are what is necessary, and I think is not adequately discussed on the left, in my view.
Okay, thanks, Alan. We're getting to the end of the time that we have for this meeting, but there are a couple of questions that I just wanted to feed back on, and I'm sorry to those people whose questions I haven't got to. But one question is, is there a more ecological way of evaluating gross domestic product? What sort of measures of a good economy should we use? A second thing is, what are your responses to the sort of practical things that are being talked about right now in many communities, like more car-free streets, expanding cycle lanes, very kind of localized things, and how do you see those things fitting into a plan? And the third thing is, What do you see the role of trade unions being in this process, and how do you win over workers, particularly who are currently in ecologically extremely damaging jobs? And, you know, all three of them in 30 seconds each. Do you want to have a go?
All right. Well, yes. I mean, first of all, about the individual actions, about cycle lanes, etc. I think Alan has also mentioned about it. It is important that, you know, that the importance of local actions is not diminished by larger debates about this. But trade union question is extremely important. But one thing which the COVID crisis has shown, that if the state is interested, and even if people are losing jobs, their income can be protected. And one of the ways of that is universal basic income. That if you are able to get acceptance on universal basic income, people will not be so much worried about losing a job. And of course, there also has to be opportunities for retraining into new activities. So in my 15 seconds, that's what I would say is my response to that.
Okay, well,
oh, yeah, GDP. Oh, I should say something about the GDP. Well, there are not really good ways of measuring GDP, because GDP is basically a measure of economic activity. It is a flawed measure. What one can do is complement that. Complement GDP along with quality of air, quality of water. So when countries are prepared, or same countries prepared over a period of time, you don't compare only GDP. You also compare, you know, other things, other indicators which are ecologically influenced.
Thanks, Alan.
well, this is around the degrowth debates. You know, I'm in favour of degrowth. I think economic growth is unsustainable, and it has to come to an end. And one of the debates around that is that we can't base it on GDP because it's a very inaccurate measure of economic activity. I mean, I don't agree. It's true that GDP is a rough and ready indicator, but it isn't a real indicator. And when we say we need degrowth, or when we need to stop growth, it is legitimate, in my view, to use GDP as a yardstick for that. I mean, the problem is that we have to win enough. I think most of the left now supports degrowth or the problems of growth, but not everybody. I mean, it is still a battle to be won to some extent on the left.
The role of the trade unions?
Well, I mean, I've been a member for the last 10 or 15 years of the campaign against climate change and the and its trade union wing, which has, to its credit, has battled away for a long time on the issue of involving the trade unions in all this, and it has made some important gains over that time. But it remains, unfortunately, it remains an uphill battle, and I don't really know the answer to it. All I know is that ultimately we have to have the trade unions involved. Where there has been some progress made in the unions, which is what Pritam has just mentioned, which is the demand for a socially just transition, for workers to have a socially just transition from a carbon-based job to a green-based job, and in other words, where the wage is protected and their job, their right to a job protected. That has been widely accepted in the trade union movement, partly because some of the international bodies have supported it. The problem is that only a very few unions are prepared to, and the PCS being being an example. You know, they've done a very good job around this. But most unions, you know, disappear once the sound of gunfire arrives, and they've got to do something about it. But there has to be a guarantee. It's one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn said very early on in his leadership of the Labour Party, that he would guarantee continuity of employment and similar wages to all workers transitioning from carbon-based jobs to green jobs, which was incredibly important. Hardly noticed at the time, but it was incredibly important. And I mean, the PCS has done a good job because they organise not only in the nuclear industry but nuclear weapons industry. You know, where they have said that, you know, we don't agree with this industry, but we will defend your jobs. You know, if there is a chance for a changeover to green production.
Okay, thanks very much, Alan, and thanks everybody for being here and for the discussion. As I said earlier, there will be